In the 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation through a series of radio broadcasts known as the Fireside Chats. His aim was to reassure the common man that our society would recover from its troubled times. But we're far from 1930, and I deal with a different kind of fire. For a new era of worldly frustration, we offer a fresh conversation. I'm Greg Carlwood, and these are the Higherside Chats.
Folks, this is a very special THC. I, along with Dave, had a chance to interview Michael Tsarion, who's definitely one of my favorite members of the so-called conspiracy community. He's an author and lecturer with works such as Origins and Oracles, The Irish Origins of Civilization, Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, and the Terrascope series. He's an expert on occult knowledge, history, numerology, astrology, and the control hierarchy that a lot of us are being influenced by on a daily basis. You can go to michaeltsarion.com. That's Michael, Tsarion.com, to learn more and check out his works and various websites. I personally find Architects of Control to be an extremely eye-opening DVD, along with his 9-hour lecture series, Age of Manipulation. Check those out if you have any interest in waking up to the bullshit in your life. Now let's get to it. Michael Tsarion. All right, I'm honored to have you here. You're one of my favorite alternative researchers, for lack of a better term, I guess. And
Thanks.
I'll, of course, provide a preface and an introduction for you when this episode goes online, but I'd rather just skip the formalities and jump into some of the questions, because I already know the material is very diverse and involved, and, we're just going to scratch the surface. So, I mean, is that all right with you?
Let's go. Yeah, that's great. Sure. I have no problem with that.
Well, a lot of your work is on symbolism and the meaning behind certain events, and I wanted to hear your perspective on two of the biggest events recently, being the royal wedding and the apparent death of bin Laden, and ask if you see any significance in them symbolically.
Well, yeah, there's not just that, but there's a lot of other things going on. I mean, one has to say, before you even start speaking in a conspiratorial angle, just from almost a layman's point of view, these kinds of fiascos are there just to, again, either edify people, keep them distracted, or to traumatize them. So we have a, sort of a good cop, bad cop, hot, cold situation going, in which they know that now that they've reduced the human race to the absolute lowest common denominator of intellect, that then you're just on this sort of slaveocracy level, in which everything that a good portion of people's reality, so to speak, is a hyper reality, a fantasy reality, a pseudo reality. Just in the same way that young kids would play with soldiers, and we grow up playing games. Once you've been reduced to the infantile level, you're still in that fantasy realm, even if you may be 40 years of age or whatever it might be. So, royal weddings, wars, dramas, it's all just a theater. The world is just a theater in which you have your guys with the black caps and the guys with the white caps, and there's this whole, so much of our world anyway today, so much of what we see isn't perceived in reality, is perceived through some digital medium. Obviously, what I mean there is the television and the cinema and the news and all the rest of it. So a lot of these things are just played out on the most basic level, is just simply bread and circuses for the masses. Yeah, that's on the most basic level. Then what you're hinting at, though, is the more subtle levels, where there may be some ritualistic elements that are much more esoteric and much more deep. And of course, I do track that. It's a full-time job, and no doubt about it that any time that the spring equinox comes up, you're going to have major rituals. There's no surprise that this last attack on Libya was again at the Feast of Purim in March, that it was timed for the crossing over point of the spring equinox, and the date that usually describes the spring equinox is, March 22nd, which is 322, which is the famous lodge number of the Skull and Bone Society. So that's just one reason. The most important one is the actual physical rising of the sun over the equinox. Is an enormously important time. That's also why in America, you guys are from the States, that tax time is around that period. Why? Why would tax time, what are taxes? That's the slave producing his wages. Why is it handed over at that time? That's because the stars of Libra are in the sky at that time, and the sign of Libra is related to the scales, which it tax people who used to come around to door in the old days, even right up to the medieval time. Their logo or their emblem over their doors, and also they would physically carry one around, was a big scales, a large scales. You'll even hear about this in the Bible with Matthew, the tax collector. And the symbol of the tax collectors from that time immemorial has been this large scales, when you used to balance rice and beans and gold and all that. And it just turns out that the stars of the scales, that's Libra, is in the sky very prominently around about this time of the year. And that's one of the reasons why the collectors, so to speak, the IRS or whatever, come out to do that. So it's just a welter of symbolism that they're using both in their corporate logos and their timing of things. And you're speaking now about two very specific events that, I even heard that the so-called, assassination of bin Laden there is almost on the same day as the birth of Adolf Hitler. It's very close to the time of the World Illuminati Celebration Day, May 15th, and then most importantly, there's a couple of other important astrological things that one needs to know about this time, and that's why the royal wedding is been timed now. One small anecdote about the royals is that the Queen of England, whose birthday is actually in May, always traditionally has celebrated it in the sign of Gemini. So she's a Taurus, but she celebrates her birthday in Gemini. You'll find this kind of displacement quite a lot. There was Prince Charles did it also, but I can't remember the incident in which he did it, where a certain festival or celebration, this was close to the time of Lady Spencer's killing, some sort of celebration was marked for October, but it didn't actually happen until later than that. And sometimes they do this because, again, they're very conscious of lunar time and sidereal time. But the two events I was going to speak about that happen in May one is that the Milky Way begins there. In stellar astrology, the Milky Way begins between the signs of Taurus and Gemini and run all the way across the zodiac to Sagittarius and Scorpio, just like a sort of a large bridge or a river. And in fact, in ancient days, the Milky Way was referred to as the river Styx, as the river of the Pharaoh, or the sacred river. And therefore, that is running very close to this period right now. And a lot of the world's traditions, including the Maya, Aztec, Egyptian, Celtic, you name it, have been precisely arranged for this particular time. Very important celebrations, I might add. And then, for instance, this particular, what they call colure, or cusp, as it's now referred to, between the signs of Gemini and Taurus is important because that's where we get the word Minotaur. In the whole Grecian myth of the hero going into the underworld to face the so-called Minotaur, it's actually a play on words. Mini being Gemini, right, the end of Gemini, and Taur being the beginning of the word Taurus. So Minotaur facing the Minotaur. This is how these myths and legends, fairy tales, folk tales are created as veneer for astrotheological stories, traditions that are only known to the initiates. The people who create the movies know this. They're still doing the same thing. That's why half the movie companies of the world have this stellar symbolism on their graphics at the very beginning, be it TriStar or Disney, or I don't care what. Right. They're all aware of this stuff, you see. So that's another important portal point that happens in Taurus. And so a lot of these things will be coordinated for this. But then the third, and I think the most important thing to realize about rituals that happen in May, is that just as I said that during tax time the stars of Libra are prominent, well, in the period of Taurus and Gemini where we are now, it's the stars of the 13th sign of the zodiac, Ophiuchus. It's actually on the other side of the zodiac, but at night its constellations are in the sky. So right now, why things are very important is because that 13th sign, under which so much ritual is done from this point of view, if you're talking about the Secret Brotherhood, the Black Lodge, the Illuminati. Therefore, they're going to always target very important relationships, very important ceremonies at this time because of the presence in the sky of Ophiuchus, the 13th sign. And that's an entire study in itself. So that's one thing to be looking into, is the presence of the 13th sign that's happening right now.
are we just carrying on an old tradition with these things, or is there an astrological draw, or is this just part of the control scheme?
It's a mixture of all. They do this in exactly the same way as you would look at a wristwatch. It's that automatic. It's that unconscious in some sense. Of course, the planning is conscious and what have you, but what I'm talking about is the ideology, the idea that you should use the cosmological symbolism to protect you, to work with. I mean, I've gone blue in the face talking about to my members of Time Gnosis that they all, who are members of that system, using even the most basic numerology for their day-to-day business affairs and so on. And people get back to me saying, they see incredible, they're actually come almost speechless with the amount of empowerment that they get from that kind of system. Well, that's just, that's just a module we've created. That's a very simplistic, but, brilliant system. Think about if you had centuries of knowledge that you could draw upon, that your advisors, high grade astronomers and astrologers, people who knew so much intimate details about symbolism, about numerology, about divination and so on, and alchemy and what have you. So obviously when they have this great power, they want to use it. They are very clever in that sense, and that's why they maintain the power that they have, because really they're not able to maintain it in other ways. If we look at history, we'll see that they've had great setbacks as well. They've not only had great infighting, these royals and these dynasties, but times have changed. Like if you examine what happened in the aftermath of the First and Second World War, the rise of the labor parties, the rise of the common man to be educated and so on, they've had major setbacks. They've had to make a lot of concessions, and they've had to scale back their overt power. What I'm saying is that the way that they used to maintain power by way of the whip and by some baron sitting in his mansion with an army of slaves, I mean, those days are over. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They couldn't maintain that anymore, so they had to scale that back somewhat. But these are very cunning people who know that ultimately, even though you may have to scale that back, or you may have to downsize or whatever, doesn't mean you necessarily have to go out of business. You just become more cunning at it, mm-hmm. and more structured at it. And we know this is an absolute fact because we see the same thing happening in the Balkans now. After the fall of communism, exactly what I'm saying took place, where you have in the Balkans, after the communists, you had many of the aristocratic, oligarchical families of the old days, the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and all of these people who've been living in London since the rise of communism. Their daughters and sons, very aristocratic people, have gone back to Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria to set up shop. Even some of them have moved back into ancestral homes. That's the palaces that are still there, albeit dilapidated. And what's the very first thing that happens? Is that all the local yokels, right, who used to be slaves, their fathers used to be slaves under these oligarchs, are now laying out red carpets and tipping their caps to these Slavic oligarchs, just so glad to have them back now that the rotten communists have disappeared. Welcome, Your Highness, and we'll be glad to bend our backs and pick your potatoes and do your grapes for you, and create your vineyards like nothing has ever happened. They're actually begging for oligarchy to come back. So let's not forget that that's exactly the same paradigm as in the West. If these Western oligarchs, pompous bastards that they are, if they could get away with an army of Irish laborers and slave labor, they'd still be doing it. Take my word for it. Yeah. It's just that they weren't able to get that, so they have to then use other means to secure their power. And one of those is the use of this incredible archive of symbolism to befuddle, to mind control, to create situations in which people start auto-hypnotizing themselves. Astrology is part of it, of course. And that's why you will have the flag-waving yokel, Joe Schmoes coming out, waving their flags, still to this day, or even worse, donning uniforms to go out and be murdered and to murder in the name of these oligarchs or the institutions that these oligarchies control. My work exposes what these institutions are. People can go to my forum. They can contact me to find out. The network of royal orgs. I have on my forum a page there called Empire of Death. People only need to go to that and start reading that, meticulously study the links that I've put up there, and they will find just how vast this oligarchical network is, even though it may be somewhat in the background, hiding behind charities, institutions like medical and educational and and philanthropic. It's the same story you have in America with the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Rand Institute, the Brookings Institute.